Okay, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Kathy Galvin, and I direct the Africa Center here at Colorado State University. And I'm also a professor in the Anthropology and Geography department. And today we are very blessed to have three fantastic women who work in conservation in various different countries in Africa and they've agreed to talk about women for the environment in Africa, conservation through an African lens. So very briefly, I just want to say who these people are, but they're going to do lengthy introductions of themselves and their work. We have Aaniyah Omardien. Raise your hand, Aaniyah. Thank you for being here. Lucy Waruingi, and sorry about saying your last name, and Zilanie Gondwe. Anyway, you can tell everyone your correct name, and we are going to hand it over to you to begin. And who would like to start? Aaniyah, you want? Okay, Zilanie. Perfect.
I'll go because I was giggling, and that's a bit naughty. So let me get serious. Thank you very much for inviting us to speak to this audience at the Africa Center. My name is Zilanie Gondwe, and I'm a conservationist across the spectrum of conservation. So I'm thrilled to be here with my two sisters from Women Environment Africa. These are great fighters in the spaces of wildlife protection, wildlife trafficking, anti-wildlife trafficking, and promotion and access. So hats off, hand on my heart to my sisters who are with me, and to you in the education sector who are bringing a new generation of other conservationists through. So what I do is I'm the director of the Institute for the Conservation of Nature, and this is an offshoot body from the Lilongwe Wildlife Trust. What Wildlife Trust does in Malawi is a lot. We protect, in partnership with the Malawi government, the natural resources of this country, i.e. wildlife in specific. So we do a lot around wildlife management, wildlife protection. I work specifically in advocacy and campaigns and communications around that, especially for prosecutions. There's a lot of loopholes there have been a lot of loopholes legally, and also in terms of how people perceive the importance of wildlife. So my job is to put wildlife at the top of the agenda in this country, together with my team and other stakeholders. So we have a multi-agency collaborative approach to this that works with the Ministry of Justice, Anti-Corruption Bureau, because as you can imagine, corruption is a really big issue here, and making sure that we get cases to court and we make it a deterrent for people to traffic in that regard is important. So that's what I do in terms of wildlife. I'm not, let me just look at me. Look at me. I'm wearing lipstick. I am not in the field. I'm not hugging the baby elephants on a daily basis. That's not really what I do. What I do is the back end work. That's working with government, being the only woman in the room so often, and convincing people and various stakeholders institutionally that we have to work together, whether they're development partners or whether they are funders in the government space or in the public space or the other CSO space. I also work in the conservation side, the environment side of conservation. So very proud of the work we do. In that regard, it's more new, it's just a few years, and we've been really, really key in leading and supporting the team of organizations that has been fighting and won at the High Court a few months ago the thin plastics ban, because plastic pollution is a huge problem. So yeah, I'm also chairperson of the Lilongwe Ecological Corridor, which is an urban biodiversity project to protect the environment in Lilongwe, to promote green spaces, green services, a green economy, and just have, a better understanding and reconnection of people and nature. So in a nutshell, sort of, that's me.
You are indeed busy. Okay, thank you, Zilanie. Aaniyah?
I'm happy to go next. Thanks, Zilanie, and thanks everyone for being here with us today and listening in and coming to share. My name is Aaniyah Omardien, and I'm based in Cape Town, South Africa, and very much involved in marine conservation specifically. I'm the founder and director for a nonprofit organization called the Beach Co-op. And we focus on building communities that care for our marine environment and for our natural environment in general. And it's been an interesting evolution of the Beach Co-op and the work that we do, because originally I started out being quite clear regarding how we keep our marine environment clean, that being the premise, that being the focus. And with time, realizing that having people on our side to care and to keep the environment clean is very, very important. So it speaks to our focus now, which is related to building those communities that care and to care for our marine environment. And this is very much linked to my PhD. So I'm busy in my second year of research alongside this work at the Beach Co-op. The topic here is co-creating a pedagogy of care for our marine environment. And it's based in Cape Town along our False Bay coastline. And one of my methods of inquiry will actually be to walk and swim along the coastline, gathering stories and trying to understand how the past is very much present in how we live today. And trying to understand which stories have been erased and trying to bring them to the fore. And then I'm also the director for another nonprofit organization called Twig, which is a sustainable fashion brand. And I've been part of the South African Sustainable Fashion Awards for the last 3 years, a judge on that panel. So that's a bit of fun. And like Zilanie, I'm not in the field all the time. I do enjoy being outdoors and spending time in nature, and particularly underwater. So I do get out every now and again to dive in the kelp forest, which is here in False Bay. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell. Thanks.
Fantastic. Thank you, Aaniyah. Lucy.
Yes, thank you, Kathy. And good morning, everyone. I guess on your side, it's morning. We're here on a late evening. And really grateful for this opportunity to connect with this program that's looking at conservation in Africa. My name is Lucy Waruingi. I'm the director of the African Conservation Center, which is a Kenyan NGO that is heading to 30 years since it was registered. And I don't know, maybe I'm the 5th director since, and it's an African-led, Kenyan registered, community-based, research-driven conservation NGO. And so the role that academia plays in providing the rigor of knowledge that's needed for conservation is very important to us, so that the research coming out of academia can inform the action that needs to be implemented on the ground. And what we do as ACC, the African Conservation Center, is really pilot some of the ideas that come out of the findings from research. And in piloting them, when we establish sort of proof of concept that this works, we then scale up and replicate the conservation action on the ground. So we're both applied research and also conservation action on the ground. My background is statistics and computer science. So I came into this world from crunching the numbers of looking at species diversity, species distribution, endemism, looking at variety of impact of conservation actions in different parks, and using data to really tell us whether we're increasing biodiversity or not, species composition studies. And so I grew into, I call myself a para-ecologist really, but from the mathematical world. And my master's program was really around spatial mapping, remote sensing, and really trying to assess resources remotely and use that to quantify the value of nature. And so specifically, I have been involved in developing the very first biodiversity atlas for Kenya. I coordinated that effort in 2014. And for the first time, we brought together all the data we had on amphibians and reptiles and plants and birds and mammals and tried to identify what the trends were. Going back, we have some really good long-term research state agencies that have data, but they're all scattered. And this was the first time the different agencies were bringing their data together to look at the trends, to look at what the key threats are, and to really look at recommendations for action. About 3 years ago, I also coordinated an effort to develop our very first Kenya National Wildlife Strategy up to 2030, which is what we are currently now using as a country to guide our conservation action. So I'm really keen on how information helps us make better decisions and how we can use that in the conservation space. But on the ground, we work a lot with local communities, really trying to empower them that they would be the people who carry on the conservation action, because individuals, NGOs, researchers come and go. And depending on either different interests or funding or lack thereof, you could do great work in a place for 20 years, and when you leave, there's no one left. So we really invest a lot in community capacity building. And I'm sure we'll be talking a bit about that later in the day. The other hat I wear is that I'm also the chair of the Conservation Alliance of Kenya. So 4 years ago, in Kenya, we decided to form an umbrella body that brings together all the NGOs in Kenya so that we can have a common platform, whether it's for advocacy or for sharing information that's emerging or people revealing new insights they have in work that they're doing. And so I currently chair that group. It's still pretty young, but we are really hoping that it will create a sort of a strong movement of civil society conservation action in Kenya. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you so much. I just want to make a note to our participants. When you have questions, please put them in the Q&A. The chat does not work, so please put your questions in the Q&A. So thank you for that. But now I want to ask each of you to talk about, or one of you give us an overview of the Women for Environment Africa and your participation in that body of women across Africa. So
yes.
Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in, and I'm sure Lucy and Zilanie will come along and join when they need to. Yeah, I mean, it's really, wow, it's a sisterhood. Zilanie mentioned that earlier, and something I never anticipated, expected. You know, when you think of a leadership program, you think of organizational structure, you think of finances, you think of, and some of that was covered, but the main take home for me was really the relationships that we built between us. There were 20 of us, and the aim is to have 100 women participate in the WE leadership course. So the next cohort is currently on the way, and we were the founding fellows. So for me, the relationships that we built and the space that was created for us to share and to show up as we are was really profound and very, very powerful. So we were able to realize that we can and we will lead together collectively as women. And there were many shared experiences, resonances around how we want to move into the future, how we want to lead, how we want to innovate and change the narrative of how conservation is currently being practiced. I'm not sure if Lucy or Zilanie want to add some more.
Very briefly, Anya, and then I can hand over to Zilanie, just to also say for the Women in Environment program, it really gave us a sense of the possibility of how we together can prod each other up to achieve more. I think the leadership space, and if there are any people listening here who are hoping to become leaders in conservation, it is rough, because conservation, you're almost always up against so many challenges externally, let alone internal challenges of trying to keep up with what's expected. And more so, because it's been a male-dominated space for so long, it's not been an easy space for women to feel bold enough to be strong and rise and do what they think needs to be done. So really having a cohort of other women that can prop you up by letting you know that you are in the right direction, can bounce off ideas of different people, but more so, we have really become very good supporters of one another's programs, as opposed to trying to see each other as competitors, which is the other challenge in the conservation world with NGOs. Yes, we all need funding. We all want to, get the awards for having saved the last tiger, but really the conservation agenda is too big for any one person to accomplish alone. And so it's given us a great space to really see the value of collective support and collective energy, which anyone really in this society is going to need if we're going to really have the conservation impact we want to have. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Thank you, Aaniyah. Absolutely. Everything you guys said about why it's important is true. You touched on this and said how, it's a very male space. The sector is very male, and creating a body or coming into a body that was specifically built for women and is organic so we can shape it to suit what we need was really important. But it's not just, this sector is not just very male. It's very white and male. Those are two different things. So as women in the environment for Africa, we're first of all African conservationists, and then we're second of all women in conservation. So these two issues are very pertinent to how we are perceived, how we are challenged, how we approach our work, often of the time. Having other women going through similar experiences, and we can prop each other up, we can network, and we can not feel like we're not competing, and we can reset the narrative around what women do in conservation and give greater visibility to the women's work in conservation, because innately women are anyway caretakers of communities and societies, and that includes the environment, is important.
Thank you so much. I mean, just listening to you, I'm totally inspired. And we're just, 10 minutes into this conversation. I just want to back up very briefly and introduce Julia Munsaka. She actually works for the Africa Center. She's a student here, a PhD student in political science at Colorado State, and she works for the Africa Center and she organizes events. So she is the most essential person in my group. So thank you, Julia, but I just wanted people to know because she's on the screen. Okay, well, thank you, everyone. We have a question from the audience that we may want to address before we move on. And this is, what can one do to be part of the Women for Environment Africa? I am really interested in being part of this cohort.
I'll jump in there. It's an application form that you need to complete, and it's changed a bit since we were part of the first cohort, but it's I think it will open again only at the end of this year for the following year. So to keep a watch on when that becomes available, probably on the website, by checking out on the website and maybe emailing someone there. I'm not sure what the dates and deadlines are. But it is an applied for position and you get selected. So there were 20 people selected. There will be 20 people selected again for next year.
Fantastic. Lucy?
And can I add to that? I'm
Yeah,
going to
sure.
add to that because that's true. That's how it has been, cohort 1 and cohort 2. But we have recently had conversations around the amount of interest we're generating from women who work in the space, and how can we better open up for others. So we're looking at other ways that women can be involved and become members of Women Environment Africa. So while the main cohort situation happens around August, the application process, there will be other ways that we want your membership and your synergy to be part of this community. So just watch out for information with us. If you'd like, I'm very happy to give you my details and we can stay connected. I never want to lose a woman who works in this space who has interest and passion. Okay.
Thank you. Lucy, did you want to?
No, I just posted, maybe you can share with the participants the website on where they can see it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Lucy. So we have another question, and when we talk about conservation, the most affected communities are Black and Brown, so we must discuss racism, colonialism, and in tandem, we then discuss decolonialization and reparations for climate change and wildlife management. Can you talk about your experiences and observation and what needs to happen to address this?
Want to go first, Zilanie?
I was totally about to throw it to you. I was like, Kenya, where are you? You guys have the best story so far. Go.
Well, I'm happy to, but and then we can share it around.
Yes.
I think for me, Kathleen, I'd like to look at this from the perspective of the beginning from the bottom. The bottom is the landowners who live on the land on which our biodiversity exists, the flora and the fauna, and then look at the lens with which conservation action sort of was pioneered, or conservation action in the terminology we use today was pioneered. So when you look at most of our African countries, which are 60 plus years in independence, a lot of the narrative around what conservation was really a Western construct of coming to secure a space that contains the beauty of our lakes, our mountains, our rivers, our wildlife, our forests, in a sense as pristine without people. And in as much as that is a sort of a very romantic view of Africa, the reality is all these spaces have always had people. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the challenges in how the conservation narrative was structured is that it assumed this was conservation being delivered. We have figured out what needs to be conserved. We have the methods, we have the tools, we're doing the research, we're coming to you to tell you how to do it. But what was very invisible is that this space has always had people. And naturally, their interaction with nature was what conservation was to them. It was nature. There wasn't really a separation between nature and people. And there really shouldn't be, as we recognize even today with all the pandemics, that we really need nature for humanity to survive. So in a sense, we ended up with a framing of conservation that assumed that people either didn't exist or didn't know what to do, and therefore needed to be informed and told and given the tools and the knowledge. And perhaps in some cases, people were seen as the problem. But when you come back full circle, you realize that these people got firewood from the forests, water from the rivers, tilled the land, were pastoralists and moved along the landscape in a very sustainable manner. So for example, the Maasais who would use firewood would never cut a tree. They would use the dead wood because they know that's already fallen off and use that for energy use at home. But of course, with urbanization and sort of the capitalistic way of development, then you have people extracting natural resources in the spaces they do not live in. So I think the first thing we really need to deconstruct is the separation of people from nature, because these are always part of how nature was. And in a sense, my take on the decolonizing is really around not only having people as participants, the landowners, they really shouldn't be the participating people we need to engage. They are the landowners who need to engage us to help them secure their land in a manner that makes sense for their livelihood. So really, not only involving the local communities, but enabling them to be the leaders and the champions of what needs to happen. When we look at the big climate change discourse, and we're trying to look at reducing emission and improving on adaptation, again, because of the degradation, the people who've taken the brunt of that impact, again, have been the same local people who actually were doing the right things from the beginning, but of course have suffered from externalities. So I think for me, the one message I'd like to pass on the decolonizing is to really think through the people at the center are the core of the conservation agenda. And we really need to look at conservation from the inside out, not conservation delivered to them, but us understanding how they conserve the natural landscape and seeing how we can either promote that, how we can amplify that, how we can resource that, so that we are resourcing their agenda, not imposing our agenda. And when I say our here, I really mean collectively. Yes, it may have initially come as a Western construct, but even in our education, it's been more of how we are taught, that conservation is this skill that you bring to a place. But that place has people who had the skill, who just hasn't been recognized or documented or acknowledged or supported. And so for me, that's a big part. Conservation from the inside out, working from what works for the people and trying to amplify that and support and resource that. Those will be my initial comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. Anyone else want to address that?
I'll jump in, Zilanie, that's okay. I think from a South African perspective, our history, our apartheid legacy has played a major role through how it segregated people and forcibly removed some through the Group Areas Act. So people have not had access to wild spaces that they had access to before. They no longer have access to. And they were moved to areas that didn't have any services and actually weren't very friendly environments to live in. If I think of Cape Town, where I currently reside, the Cape Flats, super windy, sand dunes, wetlands, the access to beaches from there are beaches that aren't the best beaches. They're rip currents. They're not friendly. And so there's been a disconnect to nature in our South African context. And part of the work that I've been doing with a nonprofit, the Beach Co-op, is to create that access and to reconnect people to nature. And it speaks to what Lucy was saying, making people the center and the traditional way that conservation has been practiced, where people are kept out of natural spaces. We need to change that narrative.
Thank you so much. Zilanie, would you like to? Are you okay?
I don't think I can add anything more to that, because I know we have a limit of time and I want you to be able to ask other questions, and I believe they've answered them all very strongly.
And we do have a question here in regards. It said that is there nevertheless a place for protected areas without people, like parks and African conservation?
I could take that and then have others respond to it. So parks, in a sense, were a good cornerstone. They helped us see the possibility of what we need to secure, should I say, save from our own selves, because the human race has actually caused most of the destruction. But having parks meant that there were places we ourselves could keep ourselves from damaging, irreversibly. However, let me just give a scenario for Kenya. Kenya has 59 parks and reserves. Those parks and reserves occupy 8% of our land mass. Now, 65% of our wildlife lives outside those protected areas. So in as much they are a critical cornerstone, in a sense, a proof of concept, I think they're great places for testing ideas and for testing methods. Parks alone cannot conserve what we need to conserve in its totality. Because of these open spaces where wildlife lived, in Kenya, that 75% land on which wildlife thrives is communally owned land. And that's why a lot of conservation action in the last 15, 20 years is trying to ensure that those areas with communities are protected, not because communities do not want to protect them, but because communities over centuries have not benefited from that protection. So money goes into parks, governments invest in putting rangers and resources into protected government areas, and almost zero resources going into these communal areas that really are hosting over 70% of our wildlife. So the imbalance, the inequity also in that the areas that are important, even outside parks, do not see the benefits that are accruing to parks, and the people who are outside those areas are expected to keep that balance. So I know for Kenya, and I'm sure greatly for most of Africa, there would be no success in conservation if we only conserved parks. So yes, parks were important. They helped us begin the understanding that we could end up destroying everything, but the data is showing that parks alone are not doing that well, number one, but two, do not contain most of our biodiversity. So it really can't be parks against people or people against parks. It's really got to be both seen as integral in supporting our natural capital.
Fantastic. Great answer. Thank you, Julie. Lucy. Anyone else want to address that? There's another question, and it has to do with the narrative about African people are the problem. And this person asks, films, books, and other media about wildlife in Africa continue to propagate the myth of wild Africa. How can we change this unfortunate narrative among the most powerful media houses? It's a big question.
Okay, I'll take that one. It's true. The wild African is very problematic. You know, it's the wild African that enjoys trophy hunting. It's the wild African that begun and found, you know, markets and created markets for wildlife products, right? No, not true. Colonialism is where this all began, but we're not going to go all the way that far back. We're just going to talk about how we can change this narrative. But first we have to talk about where this is coming from. So we have to go all the way back to history, and those responsible for where we are today need to own it, accept it. And even if you don't accept it, we'll still make sure that people know this is where it has come from. We shall use the same media to change the narrative. Fortunately, the world today and technology today allows us to have access to communicate information that didn't exist before. The digital space allows us to cheaply produce information and share it. Now we can be online, you can be on Twitter, Instagram, you can have blogs, you can set up websites, and you can go on so many sort of digital channels and put information out, films, books, that can be done. But if the people who need to hear it are not consuming it, then we're stuck. So what we need to do is to make sure that we have allies in the spaces that are unfriendly to us. People who have access to those doors must open them and invite us in. And, you know, we need white friendly faces, we need female friendly faces, we need people from other parts of the world to take us along to places that we don't have access to. Because we can only do so much independently, and we can do more when we work together. So allyship is extremely important.
Thank you. There are a couple other questions, and one is, it goes back to the conversation about national parks and who really benefits from the national parks? And I'm assuming this is today.
Maybe, I don't know about South Africa or Malawi, but in Kenya, the national park incomes from tourism go back to national parks management, protection, or to operations like salaries, not to local communities. There is instances where there's some bursaries, but they're really just a trickle of what we are making from tourism that is largely safari tourism coming out of wildlife in the parks.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that from Malawi, that is the same, but the amount of revenue that is generated from national parks is not even sufficient enough for management and operations of those parks. So it has to be subsidized, it has to be added to from other funds from across the globe. So in terms of benefit, if we're talking about the financial benefit, there isn't a clear financial benefit at all to anyone in specific, but in terms of value and benefit to people who haven't experienced wildlife, we need to see them. For children, for students to be educated and experience, nature in the right places and not in zoos. Those kind of benefits I think are more important than the financial benefit, which cannot attach a monetary value to what wildlife is.
Okay. I'd like to ask the next question. We have a few more questions in the Q&A, but I'd like to ask the next question and ask you to address it. And conservation is overwhelmingly white and male and lacking in diversity, particularly at the decision-making level. How can Africans, women in particular, be better positioned to lead in this area?
I'm so sorry. Can I ask you to repeat that question? Because I was distracted by the questions in the Q&A. I'm going to stop looking there. I'm so sorry.
Yeah. There's some interesting ones. Okay. Conservation is overwhelmingly white and male and lacking in diversity, particularly at the decision-making level. How can Africans, women in particular, be better positioned to lead in making decisions, in decision-making roles?
So I think I'm going to start off, but I'm sure Lucy and Zilanie are going to chip in. And I think this is really the purpose of Women for the Environment in Africa, and finding ourselves there as the founding fellows and speaking through some of the issues that we face and sharing what those experiences are and how we want to change the narrative, and to do so collectively. And part of this is really paying it forward as well, making sure that we bring others along and that we empower others to do the same. So creating the safe space to allow us to share stories and to collectively lead through the program has been a key means for us to build up that confidence, to empower ourselves so that we can put each other forward as well. This was mentioned earlier, and encourage each other to stand up and change the narrative.
Fantastic, thank you. Anyone else want to contribute to that question? Okay.
I'm gonna ask a question for this question. The students in your program, how many white? What's the ratio of white to color in your program?
In my department specifically, or who are interested in conservation across the university? Actually, it doesn't matter. They're mostly white, but they're also mostly, I would say, more than 50% are women.
I like that. I like that. Okay, and so in which areas of conservation are they interested in working in? Are any of those interested in working in Africa?
Absolutely. I think a number of people on this call are students who work in Africa and who are working on projects whose major professors have research in Africa. Yeah.
Okay. So look, Dr. Kathleen, a lot of students come to Africa to do research, yeah? Write papers, publish, papers, and then acquire expertise on the time they've had here working with us. And that is great for their careers, okay? And they can forge, great paths in this way. But that is taking away opportunities, because they haven't even been created yet, for African students who are interested in conservation to study in a similar way, and for their pieces and their work and their research to be accepted. We need to be our own experts. So wherever possible, we need to have conversations that are as uncomfortable as this one, that, you know, if you are interested in conservation and you want to work to help, make sure that you're letting the people who own that biodiversity, who are from that place that you are going to do research, be in front of it, not you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And for years and years and years, we have struggled with that, partly because it costs so much to support students who are not local. But whenever there's research projects and they have the capacity, that's the thing to do, is to support Africans in conservation. Couldn't agree more.
I could add something more there, because I'm really interested in the research agenda on two fronts. One is also really being more intentional and mindful about what is the appropriate research agenda that would add value to that area. And not that, you know, all research is valid, but there are times that there would be a more relevant research issue whose outcomes would create opportunities for either certain conservation action or certain, you know, policies that may need, you know, that kind of level of evidence, empirical evidence. So I think there's space also to really think about how do we design the conservation agenda, the research agenda rather, to also be driven from the questions that matter on the ground. So it does take a different style, that someone doesn't sit in a lab in whatever foreign country and imagine a question. But probably someone looks for some what do you call it, like a pre-test time when you get on the ground, interact with the people, figure out what are the real pressing issues that would add value, and then go back and write your research question, because then, you know, it's, yes, it will still get published and, you know, in the peer-reviewed journal, and you still get your degree, but you're also really responding to something on the ground that's important and urgent or relevant. But number two, I've also seen the possibility, and it's not exercised a lot, but it can be, of when one engages research assistants, because that's also common, you know, when people come on the ground. For lots of years, it's been just an assistant who doesn't need to know why I'm studying, what I'm studying, and what I'll do with it. They just need to do what I tell them. Drive here, pick this sample, write it here. But we can turn that around by creating, I like calling them like para-scientists. They may not ever get to do the first degree or second degree that early in their career, but they can understudy under a researcher who's really bringing them on board as assistants, not just as data collectors. So I think also the ethics around how research is conducted, if it would be more mindful, would also become a capacity building process. I know I'm not answering the direct question of how do we get women into the decision space, but I think it's by ensuring, as Zilanie said, we ourselves become the experts, but also where foreigners and external people have a great opportunity to be in our continent, to also see themselves as agents who help build capacity beyond just getting the degree that they need to get. Because the more people in the space, whether men or women, then the more the possibility of also rising to the next level. Yeah. So, and getting research grants, as you say, it's expensive for you to take foreign students. It's also expensive here, you know, for many individuals who may not afford it personally. But I think we could do better in our research collaborations to make sure there's some mutual beneficial benefit to the locals, not just the academic product. Yeah.
I agree, and I think I would like to think that the most of the research is also involved with local capacity building as well as adding value. It's probably not always the case, but I think that's the way that I think about it, and I think that would be, hopefully, that's the way that most people think about it as well from this side.
If I could just add something more, Kathleen. I feel that, you know, we're really at the beginning journeys for We Africa, with having 20 fellows for 5 years. The idea is to get to 100 women going through the leadership course. But for me, at the end of our year together, we actually only got to meet each other at the beginning of this year because of COVID last year. And it was an amazing experience to meet some of our sisters, is really that we want to keep the movement alive. And so we are working on projects ourselves to do so. And they're projects around we inclusivity. So how do we get more representation from countries or places that we haven't been able to reach? So addressing that need to have more women in leadership positions will take more resources, it will take more time, but we're here to do that. And then, another project that we're looking at is looking at sexual harassment in the workplace in conservation, trying to address those issues which turn women away from being in those leadership positions, and trying to, again, stand together and address things that are creating barriers for women to be in those positions.
Fantastic, great, thank you. I'd like to go back to the questions in the Q&A. We have many of them, and we only have like 13 minutes. So I am going to pick and choose. But this one is primarily for Lucy. And it says, have the dynamics balance that Lucy described changed in recent decades with increasing population? Kenya has increased in population from 8 million to 43 million since independence. Wouldn't that change things?
All right, thank you. I guess that might be the balance between wildlife in community-owned spaces, perhaps. I think maybe that's what it was. So an interesting thing has been happening in most of these African countries, that the reality is that these natural resources are not just important for conservation, they're also important for local communities. So again, giving the context in Kenya, whereas parks have remained the same, 8% of our land mass in 59 parks and reserves. A recent study showed that a good number of those, almost 20 of those parks, are paper parks, meaning there isn't any management going on. In the last 15 years, 160 voluntary conservation areas have been set up by communities. 160 voluntary conservation areas, which we call conservancies. And listen to this, they occupy 11% of our land mass. So we now have communities voluntarily setting aside area for conservation. Why? Because it matters to them also. They need the resource for their livestock, for their pastoral lifestyle, for the resources on the land, just as much as we need them for the conservation and biodiversity value. So these conservancies are now a greater success story even than our parks. So despite the increasing population, there is an opportunity of that same population setting aside areas that they do not want destroyed, but which they want to also have a role not only in conserving, but also in using sustainably. So the whole discussion of sustainable use really ought to go to a higher level where there's real opportunity for people to be allowed to use the resources on the land, but also secure those resources for the country, but more importantly, benefit from them. So in one area, like the famous Amboseli National Park that most of you know, the land is undergoing subdivision. People are now going to individually own what was communally owned, but they voluntarily are willing to set aside pockets of what is their land to be set aside for as a community conservation area, community conserved area. The only gap here so far is that there is no benefit yet coming to them, but they already are, how would I say, prioritizing the importance of setting aside these areas. So yes, population is a challenge, but I think if conservation has benefits and value, we can do it. We can secure spaces that are important for people, but secured for conservation. But the benefit then must also accrue not only to the custodians in the country level, the benefits must also accrue to the local community. And so things, innovation around carbon, around payment for ecosystem services are going to be critical as we look at a shared future where people and nature must really coexist.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Lucy. One more question before we go back to questions. And that is, in a globalized environment, how might you suggest to young students in the West to advocating for development of students in Africa and taking over the conservation in Africa as a whole? In consideration that the system itself is flawed, what would be an immediate change that they can make?
Sorry, I also got distracted by the messages. Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, it's about how, I mean, I think Lucy answered this in some ways. It's about how do you train young students in the West for advocating for development of African students. And I think it's about how people are trained here. And what this person, I don't know who it is asking is what kinds of changes can be made immediately. And from the Western side, it's about how students are trained, right? So that you are adding value to issues that are African in nature and increasing capacity building, things like that. But this person's asking what kind of change can be made now so that students in Africa can sort of take over the African agenda on conservation.
Well, I mean, for me, being part of this panel and being invited to talk today as part of the African Center and exposing your students to our stories is one very good move, because I feel that the reality for many people is that we're sitting, we're in the field mainly and having a very different perspective of what conservation issues we actually face. So the things that we spoke about in my South African context, it would be our apartheid legacy, Bantu education, the fact that Black and Brown people were specifically given a lesser education so that they would be unskilled. And so understanding those contexts is really important, and not arriving on African soil with solutions before even experiencing or learning or sharing or listening, most importantly, listening to the stories of people from the place.
Thank you. So I want to, we have about 5 more minutes, and I would like to ask another question. And it's more personal. It's like, why have you decided to work in this sector, and what do you hope to achieve? As women in conservation?
Well, I can go fast. That's an interesting question. I think, what do I hope to achieve and why am I in this sector? I'm in this sector because I believe I can make a difference, or I am making a difference. But what I'd like to achieve is to really see the people, back to the people on whose land we do conservation, really being elevated in every aspect, not only in understanding and having the tools and resources they need to face the challenges that are not their faults, but also to see them more recognized for what they've always known, whether it's their culture or their cultural practices or the indigenous knowledge that has long, is really about to disappear. How do we create visibility for these people who live on this land, but also create adequate capacity for them to live, to benefit in their livelihoods from the conservation actions we take. I think I would be more gratified knowing we have achieved conservation and we have improved the livelihoods of those who live on that land. But achieving conservation while they remain in poverty, which tends to be the case, I think is not full success. So I think I continue to be in this space to really hope for that reality one day, when those on the land really benefit from the conservation action that we are promoting. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, and Zilanie, I'll let you know.
Okay, thank you, Aaniyah. I think for me, there's a number of things, there's a whole wish list, but when I look at it all, it really comes down to the fact that I would like to see, and I hope I contribute as much as I can to this, conservation issues and the climate crisis are social inequality issues, right? And this requires a very intersectional approach, okay? It's a social justice issue, but we're not going to go down that road because we don't have time. All I will say is that the people that are most affected, the indigenous communities, the national communities, are marginalized because it's a racial issue, right? Because those who control the resources are not the people from those communities. So I would like to see greater access to resources. I would like to see strategic plans that involve, women leading implementations for conservation projects. It's a fact that women are better leaders. They are more compassionate. They are more solution-centered and willing to share. So I would like to see, a greater increase of women in the conservation space. I would like to see them taking leadership roles and being given that. And if you don't give it to us, we're just going to demand it. Take it anyway.
Thank you.
I love what you said, Zilanie, and I'll be short. I mean, for me, why I chose to work in conservation is really because everyone has the right to a healthy, clean environment, every single one of us. And so the human rights issues work alongside the environmental issues. And that is the main premise for why I am part of the conservation sector.
Brilliant. Well, I am humbled and I'm in awe of you, but I already was. So you've just added to my level of my appreciation for who you are. What I have heard is that conservation is people-focused. DEIJ has a major role to play in diversity, inclusivity, justice, has a major role to play in conservation, and women should be in leadership roles in conservation. So with that, in the last minute, do you have anything to say to our students in particular about as they sort of go on in their studies in conservation? Just maybe one sentence, 2 sentences.
One sentence from me will be that without including women, without diversity, there will be no solutions.
Perfect, thank you.
I think my one sentence would be to encourage them to dig deeper and ask the questions that are not obvious, that don't have obvious answers, and really try to understand cause and effect, what really goes on the ground and what really will make a difference. So just dig deeper.
Fantastic. Aaniyah?
And my sentence would be to pause and to listen before acting and bringing solutions.
Fantastic. Well, with that, those words of wisdom, we need to close this. So thank you all who have been here our morning, your evening. So thank you all. We really appreciate your time. And we would love to have you back. And we can, anyway, we'll talk about it. And so thank you for your time. Really appreciate it. It's just been brilliant. So thanks again and take care.
Thank
Yeah.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Kathleen,
Thank you for the
everybody.
opportunity.
Thank you.
Really appreciate. All the
Yeah.
best.
Have a
We'll
lovely
be in
day.
touch. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.